they didn't just disappear. They left behind one cryptic word carved into a tree croton. No bodies, no signs of a struggle. 115 people vanished overnight. But what if I told you this wasn't just a failed colony? What if something far darker happened? What if they were erased on purpose? For centuries, historians have searched for answers, but new evidence suggests we've been looking in the wrong place all along. This mystery isn't just unsolved, it might be deliberately covered up. And by the end of this video, you'll never look at Roanoke the same way again. By the latter part of the 16th century, England had set its sights on expanding its influence across the Atlantic by establishing a foothold in the Americas. Among the key figures driving this ambition was an English explorer, Sir Walter Raleigh. In the early 1580s, he was granted a royal charter, effectively authorizing him to claim and establish a settlement in North America. However, this venture came with a deadline. Raleigh had until 1591 to successfully create an English colony, or he would forfeit his rights to the project. Determined to make history, Raleigh began assembling resources and mapping out potential locations for settlement. By 1584, he initiated a preliminary reconnaissance expedition, dispatching 2 ships to scout the coastline of what is now North Carolina. The vessels made landfall along the Outer Banks and soon encountered the local indigenous tribes. Surprisingly, the Native Americans extended a warm welcome to these foreign visitors, inviting them to their village on Roanoke Island. During their brief stay, the English explorers observed local customs, learned survival skills, and engaged in trade, fostering a spirit of cooperation. Eager to relay their findings, the reconnaissance team returned to England, reporting favorable conditions for colonization. Encouraged by this success, Raleigh wasted no time in launching a full-fledged settlement attempt. By 1585, a fleet of 7 ships set sail carrying 600 men and provisions intended to sustain them for an entire year. However, the journey did not go as planned. Upon reaching the Outer Banks, their largest ship, the one holding the majority of their supplies, ran aground, causing vital food and water stores to be lost to the sea. Recognizing the impending crisis, the expedition leaders made a tough decision. Instead of all 600 settlers proceeding to Roanoke, 500 were sent back to England, while only 100 remained to establish the colony. Despite this initial setback, the remaining settlers maintained diplomatic relations with the indigenous people, who permitted them to build their settlement on Roanoke Island. For a time, cooperation flourished, with the Native Americans offering guidance and assistance. However, the settlers had been relying on a promised resupply mission from England, scheduled for winter. Unbeknownst to them, Queen Elizabeth had canceled the shipment, redirecting resources toward domestic matters. As winter approached and no new provisions arrived, the settlers found themselves in dire straits, forced to depend entirely on their indigenous allies for survival. This dependence soon bred tension. With food shortages worsening and suspicions rising, relations between the settlers and the Native Americans deteriorated. Misunderstandings and mistrust escalated into outright fear, culminating in a tragic turn of events. When the Native Americans chose to withdraw from Roanoke to avoid further conflicts, the settlers misinterpreted their departure as a sign of impending hostility. Acting preemptively, they launched an unprovoked harm on the indigenous community that had once aided them, unaliving many in a bid to protect themselves from a perceived threat. The settlers, now isolated and vulnerable, were in a state of panic when an English fleet happened upon Roanoke. Desperate to escape their worsening circumstances, 97 settlers immediately boarded the departing ships, leaving behind 3 of their own who had been absent during the evacuation. Fate, however, had a cruel sense of timing. Just days after their departure, a long-awaited resupply fleet arrived, only to find the colony deserted. With no one to receive the supplies, the fleet abandoned the mission and returned to England. In a bizarre twist, another English ship passing through the region weeks later discovered the vacant colony. Believing it still held strategic value, they decided to leave 15 crew members behind as caretakers of the settlement. These men were left alone to endure the elements and any unknown dangers while awaiting further instruction from England. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, John White, who had been part of the original Roanoke expedition but had returned to England, was still determined to make Raleigh's vision a reality. Convinced that a more sustainable settlement could be established elsewhere, he persuaded Raleigh to redirect efforts toward the Chesapeake Bay, an area believed to offer more fertile land and better prospects. Unlike the previous expedition, which was largely a military venture involving hundreds of men, the next attempt at colonization took a different approach. This time, the settlers would include families, men, women, and children, aiming to establish a permanent English presence in the New World. The leader of this expedition, John White, captained 3 ships set to sail toward the Chesapeake Bay, where they intended to create a new settlement. However, they planned to make a brief stop at Roanoke Island first, hoping to reunite with the 15 men who had been stationed there nearly a year earlier. John White's journey was smooth until an unexpected shift in command occurred. The fleet's chief navigator, Simon Fernandez, an experienced sailor who had guided previous expeditions, made a controversial decision. Instead of continuing north to the Chesapeake Bay as planned, Fernandez insisted on disembarking the colonists at Roanoke, refusing to take them further. Despite being the designated leader, White had little authority to challenge Fernandez, who was widely respected by the crew. The colonists were left with no choice but to begin settling in Roanoke, despite it not being part of their original plan. As they stepped ashore, the settlers anticipated meeting the 15 crew members who had remained on the island. Instead, they were met with an eerie silence. The colony was deserted, and the only trace of the men was a small pile of bones, grim evidence suggesting a violent end. White suspected the local indigenous people, possibly retaliating for past conflicts with earlier English settlers. His fears were confirmed when, just days later, a settler named George Howe was ambushed and unalived, struck by 16 arrows while walking alone. The colonists quickly realized they were in an incredibly precarious situation. With hostility mounting and supplies running low, they urged John White to return to England for reinforcements. Though reluctant, especially since his pregnant daughter was among the settlers, White agreed. Fortunately, Fernandez had remained anchored offshore, allowing White to secure passage back to England. However, White's plan to swiftly return with supplies was derailed. England was embroiled in a war with Spain, and Queen Elizabeth had placed an embargo on ships, preventing them from leaving the country. White found himself stranded in England, unable to return to Roanoke for 3 years. Finally, in 1590, with the war subsiding, White secured passage back to Roanoke with a convoy of supply ships. Hopeful but anxious, he arrived at the Outer Banks and traveled by small boat to the island, eager to reunite with the settlers. Upon landing, he and his crew called out, expecting a warm welcome, but no voices responded. As they moved inland, they discovered fresh footprints in the sand, signs that someone had recently been there, but still no one emerged. As they approached the settlement, they spotted something peculiar: the letters sorrow carved into a tree. Pushing forward, they came upon the remains of what had once been a colony, now eerily abandoned. The settlement had been transformed into a fortified structure, complete with wooden stakes forming a defensive perimeter. However, inside, there was no sign of life. No people, no remains, just overgrown grass and remnants of possessions too heavy to be carried away. On one of the wooden posts at the settlement's entrance, a single word was etched: Croton. White immediately recalled an agreement he had made with the settlers before leaving for England in 1587. He had instructed them to carve a message indicating their whereabouts if they had to leave. If they relocated voluntarily, they were to simply write their destination. If they were forced to flee under duress, they were to include a cross symbol. Seeing no distress marker, White believed the settlers had willingly moved to Croton Island, about 50 miles south. Strangely, however, White's own records indicated that before he had left for England, the settlers had discussed relocating not south to an island, but 50 miles north to the mainland, where conditions were believed to be more suitable for long-term habitation. The idea of leaving Roanoke only to move to another island seemed contradictory. John White was convinced that the missing settlers had relocated to Croton Island, as suggested by the carved inscription left behind. Without hesitation, he and his men prepared to sail the 50 miles south to confirm their whereabouts. However, fate had other plans. As they attempted to set course, the anchor line unexpectedly snapped, and a violent storm began to brew. The crew found themselves helplessly drifting north, unable to reach their intended destination. With worsening weather and deteriorating conditions at sea, the ship's captain ultimately declared that the journey to Croton was no longer feasible. The expedition had no choice but to return to England, leaving the mystery of Roanoke unresolved. John White never set foot in America again. He died never knowing the fate of his daughter, Eleanor Dare, or the 115 settlers he had left behind. For centuries, the disappearance of the Roanoke colony remained one of history's most confounding mysteries. The most widely accepted theory was that the settlers had integrated with the indigenous peoples of Croton Island, adopting their customs and way of life. Others speculated that the colony had met a far grimmer fate, perhaps wiped out by hostile Native American tribes or succumbing to starvation and disease. The case remained shrouded in speculation until the 1930s when an unexpected clue emerged. A man walking through the wilderness stumbled upon a peculiar engraved stone, later referred to as the Dare Stone. Upon examination, it was claimed that the message had been etched by none other than Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter. The inscription detailed a grim account. Half of the colonists had been slaughtered by hostile Native Americans, while another portion had been taken captive. Only a handful of survivors remained, barely clinging to life. While this discovery seemed to offer crucial insight, there was an odd discrepancy. The stone was found 50 miles north of Roanoke, not on Croton Island, where the colony was presumed to have relocated. This raised serious doubts. If the settlers had truly intended to move to Croton, why would a message from one of them appear far to the north? Some historians dismissed the stone as a false information, arguing that its discovery contradicted previously known evidence. Others, however, remained open to the possibility that the settlers had split into different factions, with some traveling north instead of south. For centuries, one of the most overlooked pieces of evidence was a set of hand-drawn maps created by John White himself. As a painter, White had meticulously charted the regions he explored, documenting geographical details with remarkable accuracy. During the 16th century, it was common for mapmakers to cover small mistakes with thin patches of canvas, correcting errors as needed. For years, White's maps had remained untouched, with various patches assumed to be minor alterations. Then, in 2011, researchers decided to analyze what lay beneath these patches. To their astonishment, they discovered a hidden fort symbol, marked by a star, located exactly 50 miles north of Roanoke, the same location where the Dare Stone had been found decades earlier. This previously concealed fort suggested that the Roanoke settlers may have established a new settlement in the area but had, for some reason, obscured its existence on the map. Even more intriguingly, faint invisible ink markings on the patch seemed to reinforce the presence of the fort, leading some historians to speculate that it had been deliberately hidden, possibly to prevent the Spanish from discovering its location in the wake of their recent war with England. This site, which became known as Site X, suddenly took center stage in the ongoing investigation into Roanoke's disappearance. Following this revelation, archaeologists launched extensive excavations at Site X, hoping to find definitive proof of an English settlement. While no physical fort has yet been uncovered, researchers have unearthed fragments of English pottery, metal tools, and other artifacts dating back to the late 1500s. This suggests that at least some of the Roanoke settlers may have moved north, potentially abandoning their original colony in favor of a more sustainable location. Yet, even with these findings, significant gaps in the story remain. If the settlers truly relocated north, why did they carve Croton on the tree and post at Roanoke? Did the settlers split into multiple groups, with some moving north and others heading south? Why has no physical evidence of the 115 missing colonists, such as graves or human remains, ever been found? Despite centuries of exploration and research, the fate of the Roanoke colony remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. As new discoveries emerge, the case grows even more intriguing, suggesting that the lost settlers may not have simply vanished, but instead left behind a trail of cryptic clues that continue to puzzle historians to this day. The Roanoke settlers vanished without a trace. But did they leave behind a hidden message we've been missing all along? A lost colony, a mysterious fort, and a trail of cryptic clues that just don't add up. Was this history's greatest cover-up? The truth may still be buried somewhere out there, waiting. What do you think happened? Drop your theories in the comments, and if you love mind-blowing historical mysteries, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what we uncover next.